Alright, let's talk about William Wordsworth, the poet who gave English literature its purest expression of nature and emotion. He was born in 1770 at Cockermouth, just outside the Lake District. Yes, that little geographical detail is often asked in exam. His father was a lawyer who died when William was only 13, leaving him and his siblings in financial uncertainty. The family money was tied up, so William's education depended on the generosity of two uncles. He attended Hawkshead School near Lake Windermere, the landscape that would later fill his poetry with lakes, hills, and quiet beauty. In 1787, he went on to St. John's College, Cambridge. But honestly, his time there wasn't remarkable. He graduated in 1791 without any grand plans for the future. After university, he spent a short time in London, then crossed to France, where he got swept up in the excitement of the French Revolution. This period shaped him deeply. He even captured his early enthusiasm in one of the most quoted lines of his poetry: "Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven." And yes, that's been directly asked in exam. But things changed quickly. When he returned to Paris in 1792, the revolution had turned violent, the September massacres had horrified him, his faith in political idealism was shaken. For a while, he sympathized with the Girondins, the moderate Republicans. But when his allowance was cut off, he was forced back to England, disillusioned and broke. Back home, he began rebuilding his life. He settled with his sister Dorothy, his lifelong companion, first in Dorset, then in Alfoxden, where he met and befriended Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Their long walks and endless conversations inspired Lyrical Ballads, published in 1798, the book that basically launched English Romanticism. That connection with Coleridge and the ballads themselves have been frequently tested in exam. After a brief trip to Germany, Wordsworth returned to the Lake District for good. He lived at Dove Cottage in Grasmere, then moved through Allen Bank and the parsonage before finally settling at Rydal Mount in 1813, his home until his death. He even took a job as distributor of stamps for Westmoreland, which gave him financial stability. Imagine that the poet of nature also worked in tax stamps. Over the years, his fame grew, even though his early poems were mocked as dull or too simple. By the time he received an honorary DCL degree from Oxford in 1839, critics had changed their minds. In 1842, he received a £300 pension from the Crown, and when Southey died, Wordsworth became Poet Laureate in 1843, a fact that comes up repeatedly in exam. But his ideals changed over time. The radical young revolutionary became a cautious conservative. He opposed the Reform Bill, and some contemporaries saw him as a sellout. Browning even wrote The Lost Leader about him, though. As Wordsworth would have pointed out, that was more fiction than fact. He wasn't lost, just older and more cautious. What never changed, though, was his sense of poetic purpose. Wordsworth believed his work would outlive him, and he was right. His enormous self-belief, what some call gigantic egoism, turned out to be justified. His sister, Dorothy, remained his emotional anchor, and his circle included Coleridge and other radical thinkers of the Romantic age. Shelley even wrote a poem called To Wordsworth, which has been asked in exam, where he both admired and subtly criticized Wordsworth for turning away from youthful idealism. So, from a lonely boy in Cockermouth to the Poet Laureate of England, Wordsworth's life reads almost like one of his own poems, a journey from enthusiasm to reflection, from rebellion to calm acceptance. And through it all, he never stopped believing that poetry could express the deepest truths of the human spirit. Alright, let's talk about the poetic journey of William Wordsworth, the man who helped launch the Romantic movement and changed English poetry forever. Believe it or not, Wordsworth's earliest verses were actually imitations of Alexander Pope. Yes, the same Pope who stood for balance, order, and classical rules. This detail about his early style has been asked in exam. But soon, Wordsworth began to move in a completely different direction, one that turned toward nature and emotion rather than polished wit. His first published works were An Evening Walk and Descriptive Sketches, both from 1793. These early poems didn't yet show his full originality, but they hinted at his growing fascination with nature and personal experience. That's an exam favorite, his university poems and their dates. Then came the turning point, Lyrical Ballads in 1798, a joint effort with Samuel Taylor Coleridge. This book is considered the official beginning of the Romantic movement, and that fact has been tested many times in exam. Wordsworth contributed the larger share, and while some poems like The Thorn were criticized as trivial, others such as Simon Lee and especially Tintern Abbey revealed his deep emotional connection with nature. Tintern Abbey, by the way, is often listed among his greatest works. Mark that for exam. During a visit to Germany, he wrote Lucy Gray and Nutting, two quiet but powerful poems about innocence and solitude. Around the same time, he began planning the Prelude, a long autobiographical poem completed in 1805. It explores his spiritual and poetic development, what he called the growth of a poet's mind. This too is an important exam point. Interestingly, the Prelude was never published during his lifetime, another favorite question. Wordsworth intended the Prelude to serve as an introduction to a much larger philosophical poem called The Recluse, but he never finished it. The part that did appear, The Excursion, was published in 1814 and ran to 9 long books. Critics found much of it dull and prosaic, and that comparison between the Prelude and The Excursion often turns up in exam questions. The Excursion simply doesn't have the freshness and passion of the Prelude. After that, Wordsworth's poetic power began to fade. His later works include The White Doe of Rylstone in 1815, The Wagoner and Peter Bell in 1819, Yarrow Revisited in 1835, and The Borderers in 1842. These later poems often feel verbose and less inspired, though now and then, like in Yarrow Revisited, there's a flash of his old brilliance. Even so, his productivity remained incredibly high. He kept writing and refining until the very end. The romantic flame might have burned softer, but it never really went out. So, if you're revising for exam, remember these key things. Lyrical Ballads, 1798, marked the romantic breakthrough. Tintern Abbey and Lucy Gray capture his finest simplicity. The Prelude, 1805, was his masterpiece in blank verse. The Excursion, 1814, was long, moral, and comparatively dull. And The Recluse, the big dream, was never completed. In the end, Wordsworth's journey is a story of early imitation, creative revolution, mature greatness, and gentle decline. But even in that decline, he shaped a vision of poetry that still defines what we mean by Romanticism today. All right, let's talk about William Wordsworth, the poet of nature, reflection, and quiet strength. But before we start praising him too much, let's be fair. Wordsworth's poetry has its share of limitations too, and examiners love asking about those. So first, the big picture. Wordsworth's poetry isn't consistent. There's real inequality in his work. Some poems are deeply moving and philosophical, while others feel flat or even dull. Matthew Arnold, in fact, said Wordsworth's best work ends around 1808, and yes, that exact comment has been asked in exam. After that, his poetry became more moralizing and less inspired. Now, one of his longest works, The Excursion, shows this clearly. It's meditative and reflective, but also, honestly, pretty prosaic. Wordsworth sometimes struggled to recognize his own limitations. He lacked humor, dramatic power, and a strong narrative sense. His play, The Borderers, was only a partial success, and even narrative poems like Ruth aren't among his best. But what he lacked in dramatic flair, he more than made up for in reflective beauty. You see, Wordsworth's ego was strong, almost heroic, you could say. His self-belief was immense, probably encouraged by the admiration of his family and friends. And that confidence helped him create the Prelude, his greatest work, where he turned his own life and mind into poetry. Now, let's talk about his real strength nature. Wordsworth's best gift wasn't lyrical passion like Shelley or humor like Burns. Instead, he was a poet of deep reflection and calm observation. His nature poems aren't wild or mystical, they're steady, thoughtful, and full of quiet joy. That's why exam questions often focus on his reflective mood in poems about nature. Take the famous line, "My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky." It's simple, but it captures that spontaneous joy he felt in nature, a joy that never faded. Then there are the Lucy poems, where his emotions are intimate but restrained. Remember the line, "She dwelt among the untrodden ways beside the springs of Dow." This too has been asked in exam. It shows how even in loss or solitude, Wordsworth finds beauty and tenderness. His sonnets are also worth noting. They're not fiery or passionate, but deeply meditative, among the finest in English poetry. And when it comes to observation, Wordsworth's eye was unmatched. As he said, he wrote with his eye steadily fixed on the object. In Resolution and Independence, or "There was a roaring in the wind all night," you can feel how precisely he heard and saw the world around him. Both of those lines have appeared in exam questions. Nature for Wordsworth isn't just scenery, it's a living presence, a spiritual teacher. He believes the soul comes from the same source as nature. As he wrote, "The soul that rises with us cometh from afar." That one line sums up his whole philosophy. Nature connects us to something eternal. So, in short, Wordsworth's poetry may not always sparkle, but when it does, it's because he looks at nature and life with a calm, reflective, and spiritual eye. His greatness lies not in drama or passion, but in quiet understanding and joy. If there's one turning point in English literature that every exam loves to revisit, it's the publication of Lyrical Ballads in 1798. This collection, written mostly by Wordsworth with a few poems by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, marks the true beginning of Romanticism in English poetry. Now, the 1798 edition titled Lyrical Ballads with a few other poems includes some of Wordsworth's earliest and most important pieces. Poems like Simon Lee, We Are Seven, Lines Written in Early Spring, Expostulation and Reply, and The Tables Turned, all of these reflect his love for nature and common life. The Thorn, another key poem, has also been asked in exam. And of course, there's Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey, often just called Tintern Abbey, which is one of his absolute masterpieces, and yes, it's an exam favorite. Now, Coleridge contributed just 4 poems to this volume: The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, The Foster Mother's Tale, The Nightingale, and The Dungeon. Each of these has also appeared in exam at some point, especially The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which became one of the defining works of English Romanticism. When the Lyrical Ballads were first published, readers didn't quite know what to make of them. The language was simple, almost plain, and the subjects were ordinary people, shepherds, vagrants, children. But that was exactly Wordsworth's point. Poetry, he said, should speak in the real language of men. That idea became the foundation of Romantic poetry. By 1800, a second edition appeared, Lyrical Ballads, with other poems, and this time Wordsworth added his preface to the Lyrical Ballads. Now, the preface has been asked repeatedly in exam. In it, Wordsworth laid out his poetic philosophy, that poetry springs from emotion recollected in tranquility, that imagination transforms the ordinary, and that nature is our greatest teacher. The 1800 edition also introduced his famous Lucy poems, She Dwelt Among the Untrodden Ways, A Slumber Did My Spirit Seal, 3 Years She Grew, and Strange Fits of Passion Have I Known. These short, haunting lyrics have all appeared in exam, so make sure you know them. Other key poems from this volume include Michael, Lucy Gray, and The Ruined Cottage, all exploring rustic life and human emotion. Then, in 1807, Wordsworth published poems in 2 volumes, which brought us some of his best-known works, Resolution and Independence. I wandered lonely as a cloud or daffodils. Another must know for exam. My heart leaps up, ode. Intimations of immortality, the solitary reaper, and composed upon Westminster Bridge. Each of these poems celebrates the relationship between human feeling and the natural world. He didn't stop there. His later works include The Excursion in 1814, Peter Bell in 1819, yes, that one's been asked in exam, and The Prelude, published posthumously in 1850. The Prelude is his autobiographical masterpiece, a long, reflective poem tracing the growth of his own mind and imagination. That title, too, comes up frequently in exam papers. If you're studying for the UGC NET exam, here's what you should always remember. Lyrical Ballads 1798 marks the birth of English Romantic poetry. The Preface 1800 defines its philosophy, and the Prelude 1850 gives it its grand spiritual depth. Everything in between, Lucy Gray, Michael, daffodils, the solitary reaper fills out the world. Wordsworth built around nature, memory, and emotion. He and Coleridge changed not just how people wrote poetry, but how they thought about life. And that's why every exam, literally everyone finds a reason to bring them back. Alright, let's slow down and step into one of the most peaceful and profound poems ever written, Wordsworth's Lines Written a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey. Now the full title, and yes, this has been asked in exam, is Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey on Revisiting the Banks of the Wye During a Tour, July 13, 1798. Wordsworth wrote it after walking with his sister, Dorothy, through the Welsh borders. It had been 5 years since his last visit, and the poem opens with that quiet sense of distance and return. 5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters. Lines that have appeared repeatedly in exam papers. He begins by describing what he sees: the steep and lofty cliffs, a dark sycamore, the orchards, cottages, and the thin blue smoke curling up from human homes. You can picture the scene gentle, calm, and full of life. He imagines hermits or wandering dwellers living deep in the woods, where by his fire the hermit sits alone. Those very lines have been asked in exam too. But as the poem moves forward, something changes. It's not just about what he sees, it's about what he remembers. These woods, he says, have been a healing presence in his life. Their memory has brought him sensations sweet, feelings that lifted his spirit, shaped his moral being, and inspired acts of kindness and of love. When he was away, the recollection of nature became his inner refuge. Now, though he realizes he's no longer the same person he was 5 years ago, he says that his youthful self loved nature for its physical beauty, for its wild power and excitement. But with age, he now sees something deeper. Nature has become, for him, a teacher and a spiritual guide. He hears what he calls the still, sad music of humanity, one of those famous exam lines that captures his mature vision, nature, as something that reveals both joy and sorrow, peace and empathy. He senses a motion and a spirit that runs through all things, the sun, the sky, the air, even the mind of man. Nature, to Wordsworth, is alive, it's divine. It shelters his thoughts and keeps his soul pure. Even if he lost this sense someday, he says, the memory of these moments would still bring him quiet happiness. And then the poem becomes even more tender. He turns to his sister, Dorothy. Through her, he sees his younger self, her energy, her delight, her closeness to nature. He prays that she, too, will always find comfort and faith in the natural world. Nature, he says, never betrays the heart that loves her. She leads from joy to joy, from innocence to understanding, and even to a kind of faith that endures all pain. He imagines a time when Dorothy might feel lonely or burdened, and he hopes that she'll remember this moment, their shared walk by the Wye, his love for her, and their mutual love for nature. It's beautiful. right? What started as a simple return to a place became a meditation on time, memory, love, and the transforming power of nature. Now, a quick side note for exams. Tintern Abbey was published in the first edition of Lyrical Ballads in 1798, the collection by Wordsworth and Coleridge that launched English Romanticism. In the expanded 1800 edition, Wordsworth added his famous preface explaining his poetic philosophy, and that preface has been directly asked in exam. Another small but useful fact, The Convict, a poem by Wordsworth, appeared in the 1798 edition but was dropped in 1800 and replaced with Coleridge's Love. That switch too comes up in question. So, Tintern Abbey is much more than a nature poem. It's Wordsworth's spiritual autobiography, his belief that nature heals, teaches, and connects us to something infinite. Alright, let's talk about one of the most famous poems in all of English literature, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, also known simply as Daffodils. The poem was inspired by a real moment in William Wordsworth's life. In 1802, Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy were out walking near Ullswater Lake in the Lake District when they came across what Dorothy described in her journal as a long belt of daffodils. This moment stayed with Wordsworth for years, and he finally turned it into poetry around 1804. It was first published in 1807 and later revised in 1815. Those dates often appear in exam, so make a note. Now, the poem is written in 4 6-line stanzas with the rhyme scheme AB, AB, CC, and each line follows iambic tetrameter, meaning 4 beats per line. Yes, that technical detail has been asked in exam. The poem opens with that famous image, I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills. Here Wordsworth imagines himself drifting aimlessly, almost dreamily like a cloud. And then suddenly he sees it, a whole host of golden daffodils beside the lake, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. This first encounter has been directly quoted in exam. The daffodils seem endless, stretching in never-ending line along the bay, as numerous as the stars in the Milky Way. That comparison gives a sense of infinite beauty and wonder. The poet says, 10,000 saw I at a glance, and he watches them tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves of the lake sparkle too, but even they can't outshine the joy of the flowers. And then comes the turning point, the realization that he didn't fully understand the experience at the time. He writes, I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. That wealth is emotional and spiritual, not money, but a richness of memory. Later, when Wordsworth is alone lying on his couch, in vacant or in pensive mood, the image of the daffodils flashes upon his inward eye, a phrase that's been tested in exam. This inward eye is the imagination, the mind's power to recall and relive beauty. Whenever he remembers the scene, his heart fills with pleasure and dances with the daffodils. What's beautiful here is how simple the language is, and yet how deep the feeling runs. Wordsworth shows us that nature's beauty doesn't just give momentary delight, it becomes a lasting source of joy and inner peace. So, in short, Daffodils captures the essence of Wordsworth's romantic vision, the idea that nature, memory, and solitude can lift the human spirit. And if you remember only one line for exam, let it be this: they flash upon that inward eye which is the bliss of solitude. Alright, let's talk about one of Wordsworth's most profound poems, Ode. Intimations of Immortality from Recollections of Early Childhood. That full title has been asked in exam, so don't forget it. Wordsworth worked on this poem in 2 bursts. He began it in 1802 and finished it in 1804. The first 4 stanzas, which deal mostly with childhood, were written in 1802. Then, 2 years later, he added 7 more, rounding it out to 11 stanzas in total. It was first published in his Poems in 2 volumes in 1807, revised later in 1815. All these dates have been tested in exam. Now, fun fact, when Wordsworth showed the early part to his friend Coleridge, Coleridge responded with his own famous poem Dejection and Ode. This literary exchange has also been asked in exam. The poem itself is an irregular Pindaric ode again, that's an exam keyword, and it moves through three broad emotional stages. It begins with a feeling of loss. The speaker looks around at nature, the meadow, grove, and stream, and feels something missing. He says, the world once seemed apparelled in celestial light, but that radiance has faded. He moans, the things which I have seen I now can see no more. These lines capture that sense of growing up and losing the child's divine vision. Both have been directly asked in exam. Then comes the middle section. Wordsworth starts thinking about why this happens. His answer is the doctrine of pre-existence, the idea that our souls come from heaven and that children still carry traces of that divine memory. Heaven lies about us in our infancy. He writes one of the most famous and exam-frequent lines in the poem. But as we age, that vision fades, veiled by what he calls a sleep and a forgetting. Life's duties, ambitions, and earthly freight weigh us down, and the pure spiritual light dims. But the last movement turns toward hope. Even though we lose that immediate sense of divinity, Wordsworth says something remains: primal sympathy, a philosophic mind. And finally, those unforgettable closing words. Thoughts that do often lie too deep for tears. That closing line too has been highlighted in exam. The poem also echoes his prelude in its psychological depth. It's about how memory, imagination, and faith can restore meaning after innocence fades. And here's an interesting side note. Wordsworth once called the child the best philosopher, which Coleridge actually criticized, another detail examiners like to test. So, to sum up, the ode begins in sorrow, moves through reflection, and ends in spiritual strength. It's Wordsworth's way of saying that even as we lose the glory and the dream of childhood, something divine still lives on in the mature mind, quieter, maybe, but deeper and more enduring. Alright, let's talk about London, 1802, one of Wordsworth's most famous moral sonnets. This poem has shown up again and again in exams, so pay attention to its tone, its structure, and especially how it connects Wordsworth to Milton. The poem was written in 1802 and later published in Poems in 2 volumes in 1807. It's a passionate appeal where Wordsworth's speaker actually calls upon the spirit of John Milton, yes, the Milton, to return and restore England's lost greatness. It begins with a cry that sets the mood immediately. Milton, thou shouldst be living at this hour. England hath need of thee. These opening lines have been asked in exams several times. Wordsworth is basically saying, Milton, where are you? We need you now more than ever. He paints England as a fen of stagnant waters, a swamp of moral decay. The country, once great and noble, has become selfish, shallow, and spiritually dead. In the octave, that's the first 8 lines of the Petrarchan sonnet, he lists all the areas of English life that have lost their inward happiness: the altar, the sword, and the pen. In other words, religion, chivalry, and art have all become hollow. Even home life, the fireside, the wealth of hall and bower has lost its moral center. This whole section criticizes England's institutions for lacking virtue and sincerity. Then comes the sestet, the final 6 lines where Wordsworth turns from despair to admiration. He recalls Milton's character and moral greatness. He says, thy soul was like a star and dwelt apart. Thou hadst a voice whose sound was like the sea. Both of these similes, the star and the sea, have been asked in exam. The star stands for Milton's purity and constancy, while the sea suggests his vast power and moral depth. Wordsworth goes on to praise Milton for being both majestic and humble. He calls him pure as the naked heavens, majestic, free, but also notes that Milton, in cheerful godliness, carried out even the lowliest duties. So he wasn't just a genius, he was also grounded, virtuous, and kind. And that's what Wordsworth wishes England could return to: a sense of manners, virtue, freedom, and power. These 4 qualities have been directly tested in exam. The whole poem is a blend of political disappointment and moral yearning. It's not just about Milton. It's about what Milton represents, a moral guide who could lift England out of its selfishness. Now, a quick note on Form London. 1802 is a Petrarchan sonnet, meaning 14 lines of iambic pentameter divided into an octave and a sestet. Wordsworth uses this classical structure to deliver a modern moral message. If you're comparing, remember, A. Samuel Johnson's London 1738 is a satirical poem in heroic couplets, and only William Blake's London 1794 is a cry against social oppression. And Wordsworth's London 1802 is a moral and patriotic appeal, not satire, not despair, but reform through virtue. So next time you read this sonnet, think of it as a letter to Milton's soul, a reminder that England's true glory doesn't lie in power or wealth, but in purity, humility, and conscience. Alright, let's talk about one of Wordsworth's most famous sonnets, The World is Too Much With Us. This poem is a perfect snapshot of Wordsworth's romantic spirit and his deep frustration with the materialism of the industrial age. It was written around 1802 and first published in Poems in 2 volumes in 1807, and yes, both the date and the publication title have been asked in exam. Now, this poem is a 14-line Italian or Petrarchan sonnet written in iambic pentameter. That's another exam point to keep in mind. Structurally, it's divided into an octave and a sestet. The octave usually presents an idea or problem, and the sestet responds to it. The rhyme scheme for the octave is A, B, B, A, B, B, A, which has been tested in exam, and the sestet here runs C, D, C, D, C, D. So, what's the problem Wordsworth raises? He looks around at modern society, the early years of the Industrial Revolution, and he sees people obsessed with money, possessions, and productivity. He opens with one of the most quoted lines in all of Romantic poetry. The world is too much with us. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. That line has appeared directly in exam. So note it. He's saying that in our rush to earn and spend, we've lost something vital, our connection to nature. We've given our hearts away, he says, calling it a sordid boon, a kind of shameful gift we've traded for material comfort. Humanity, he laments, is out of tune with the rhythms of the natural world. Even when the sea bares her bosom to the moon or the winds howl across the land, we barely notice. Then comes the turn the sestet, where Wordsworth imagines what it would be like to see the world through a different lens. He even says he'd rather be a pagan, worshipping old gods like Proteus rising from the sea or Triton blowing his horn, because at least that ancient faith allowed people to feel awe before nature. That emotional intensity, that longing for a more sacred connection with the natural world is the poem's heart. So, what makes this sonnet so powerful? It's short, structured, and rhythmic, but the feeling behind it is immense. Wordsworth isn't just criticizing greed, he's mourning a spiritual loss. For him, nature was never just scenery, it was the language of the divine. In short, this poem captures Romanticism in a nutshell: emotion over intellect, spirituality over materialism, and nature as the true teacher of the human soul. Alright, let's talk about the Prelude, one of the greatest autobiographical poems ever written. The full title is The Prelude or Growth of a Poet's Mind, an autobiographical poem. And yes, that full title has been asked in exam. The poem is written in blank verse and traces Wordsworth's own journey as a poet, his growth, his memories, and his evolving relationship with nature. What's interesting is that Wordsworth never actually titled it The Prelude himself. He simply called it the poem to Coleridge. The title, The Prelude, was added later by his wife, Mary, after his death, when the poem was finally published in 1850. That little detail about the title being given posthumously is a favorite exam question. Now, Wordsworth began writing it in 1798 when he was just 28 years old, and it was meant to serve as the introduction to a much larger, unfinished philosophical poem called The Recluse. The Recluse was supposed to be a kind of grand trilogy, 3 times longer than Paradise Lost, but Wordsworth only completed the Prelude and the Excursion. He always felt a bit of agony about never finishing the project. Coleridge, his close friend and inspiration, played a huge role here. He constantly encouraged Wordsworth to work on The Recluse. In fact, in a letter from 1799, Coleridge wrote urging him to write something for those who had lost hope after the failure of the French Revolution, a poem that could rekindle faith in humanity and nature. This specific letter and Coleridge's influence have been asked in exam. Wordsworth himself paid tribute to Coleridge in the 1850 edition, calling him a dear friend, most distinguished for his knowledge and genius, to whom the author's intellect is deeply indebted. That line often appears in exam questions as well. Now, the big idea behind the Prelude is that it's a philosophical poem about man, nature, and society. Wordsworth wanted to show how a poet's mind develops through constant communion with nature, how imagination, perception, and moral growth come together. In her study, Narrative Means to Lyric ends in Wordsworth's Prelude. Monique R. Morgan describes the poem as tracing Wordsworth's assurance of his poetic mission through interactions with nature, another quote that's been highlighted in exam. Essentially, the poem is Wordsworth proving to himself and to us that he was born to be a poet, that his life itself was the making of poetry. Structurally, the Prelude has 14 books, each tracing a stage in this inner journey. Let me quickly summarize a few key ones, because book-based questions are common in exam. The introduction and school time books focus on childhood and early memories. Residence at Cambridge explores his university life. Cambridge and the Alps captures a turning point, his encounter with the sublime in nature. Residence in London shifts to urban experience and disillusionment. Later books like Imagination and Taste, how impaired and restored trace his psychological recovery and renewed faith in creativity. The final conclusion circles back to harmony, the unity between human consciousness and the natural world. So, in short, the Prelude is Wordsworth's spiritual autobiography in verse, a story of how his imagination matured through his bond with nature, his friendship with Coleridge, and his reflections on the modern world. It was meant as the prologue to something even bigger, The Recluse, but instead it became his masterpiece and one of the defining works of English Romanticism.